Hello future me and everyone else watching. Today I'm going to turn a bunch of fabric scraps into a bag. Do you ever watch those videos that go on about useful ideas for using up your fabric scraps and you're just sat there surrounded by tiny pieces of scrap fabric like this and you just become increasingly annoyed by how you could possibly turn fabric scraps into a hair scrunchie? If you are one of those people who gets annoyed at videos just like that, then my video is for you. So I got given a bundle of raffia as a gift and I decided to look into what things I could make using this material, and it led me to looking at baskets and bags made out of raffia, and I came to the wearescout.com website where they have a really cool coiled raffia basket tutorial, and then I looked elsewhere on their website and found a fabric coil bowl tutorial where it looks like you get lots of long strips of fabric and I guess tie those together to make long yarn out of old t-shirts and stuff, which inspired me to turn my scraps of fabric into long pieces of cord, wrap thread around them, and then sew those together in a coil to make a bag. So I started off by dumping out the bags of fabric onto my table so I could start sorting out the larger fabric scraps that I'll use on the outside from the smaller fabric scraps to use on the inside of the tube. Any big pieces that were attached to smaller ones were just snipped off and assorted into the piles. Basically the idea is you take one of the bigger pieces of fabric and lay it down, then start scrunching the smaller scraps in your hands until you get the thickness that you want, and then place that on the bigger piece and roll it up. The best way I found to do this was to hold the scraps in place using my thumbs, then pulling the loose edge of the fabric that is furthest away from me towards me and tucking it underneath the scraps, encasing them in the tube. Then I pulled the other end of the loose fabric taut and kept rolling the tube towards me and pulling that fabric. Then I temporarily secured the rolled fabric in place with pins before sewing some regular sewing thread onto the folded end and simply wrapping this around the roll. This worked well enough to stop the tube from unravelling while I worked on adding more fabric. Once I felt I'd had enough to start working with the roll, I then sewed some coloured embroidery thread to the end of the tube, tied a knot, and then wrapped the thread around the end of the tube, making sure to catch that little tail of the thread. The end of the roll then gets folded over on itself and the thread is wrapped around once more. Then I take the needle that the thread is attached to and insert it into the middle of the coil. In this case it's the floral fabric that I'm going to be putting the needle into, and this is where I start to do the blanket stitch. So I don't feel like I showed properly how to do this in the video, so I'm just going to show it now. I've just made these two tubes and I've just wrapped them in black thread. We've got the purple tube, which I have already put thread on. We've got a yellow tube. I'm going to sew them together using the blanket stitch. So for the purpose of this is the front, back's here, and this is the top, and that's the bottom. So when we do a blanket stitch we're going to end up with a line of thread going down here on the top. So I'm going to take the needle, insert it from the front. So I haven't pulled the needle through the thread through the whole way. I just wanted to show you this loop. So I'm going to turn it back on itself, so there's two loops, and then I'm going to pull the thread through that second loop. So we have our thread at the top. So it doesn't look like it's going to work I'm going to try and... I always find that the first one is a bit like the first pancake in that it's a bit rubbish. So we're going to go again from the back to the front. Here's the loop. I'm going to twist it. So then there's 2 loops. And then I'm going to pull the needle through that second one. And it has kind of worked. So let's just keep going along. Eventually you don't have to do an extra twist in the loop, it just does it. I think it's just the first stitch is a bit like that first pancake in that it's really, really bad. But then eventually all the stitches end up along the top. Ta-da! Rustic, charming. You also don't need to use a bent needle. It's just that throughout making the bag, the needle got a bit bent. It's also the only needle that I have that has a large enough eye in it for using with embroidery thread. As you can tell, I've already made half the bag when I filmed all this. So in order to keep the 2 halves the same size, I periodically checked that I was matching the size and the colour placement of the completed size with the side that was still in progress. If I noticed that the coil was a bit thin, then I would know to just add a bit more to the inside of the fabric tubes, like more fabric scraps, and if it was too thick then I could just not add as much. And then when it comes to changing colours, it's literally simply a case of using different coloured fabric. But to change the colour of the thread, or to replace the thread that's run out, you would need to put a stitch at the top of the T shape of your blanket stitch. And then another stitch on the coil, and then just snip off the end. Then take your new thread and then do this again but reverse it, so you would put a stitch at the coil and then one at the top of the blanket stitch, and then you carry on going. Sometimes when I was working I found that I hadn't put enough stuffing into the tube and I didn't want to undo what I'd done, so I just used an awl to push some more scraps into the tube. You could use like a knitting needle or a pencil perhaps, just something that isn't going to get caught onto the scraps and pull them back out again. And here's another angle of the blanket stitching. Eventually, once you've bored yourself to tears repeating adding more fabric and blanket stitching it all together, you'll get something that looks a little bit like this. So I'm getting to the point where I'm going to be able to put the strap on the bag, which I have put a pin in to indicate. Let me just grab the other side and then I set it against it so that I could get the straps, not straps, in the same place for both sides. It's the idea is that when I get to here, this part will come out and then come back down here. Then I'll pause and I'm going to do the inside. Like, I'll show you on this one. So the inside section here is a separate piece that goes around the middle to reinforce the handle, and then I go all the way around the outside again and then do a third piece for the handle. So when I get around to this part here, I'll use the other half of the bag to make sure the handle is the right length for the bag, so I don't end up with wonky handles. So I've got to my pin marker and I'm going to just do a couple more blanket stitches. Then I'll continue wrapping the thread around the free part of the handle, following the same rules of doing a blanket stitch, just without actually putting the needle through any fabric. It's a little cumbersome and it will take some time, but it is doable. You just need to readjust the stitches as you're going along to make it look uniform. If when you're sewing the blanket stitch on the handle you need to change the thread, it's the same as before. You just put a stitch at the top where that T shape is, and I brought the needle round to the underside of the fabric, inserted it into the handle, then pulled it out an inch down from where I inserted it, then held the thread taut and pulled it so that the handle bent slightly. Then I snipped it off as close as I could to where it came out of the fabric, and when the handle unbent, it pulled that little tail back into the fabric so you can't see it. Then to add the new colour, you'll do the same thing but in reverse. So put the needle in and pull it back out again about an inch away from where you inserted it, and then very carefully pull that thread through until it just disappears below the surface. Then you can put your anchor stitch in and you can carry on sewing. So once I had enough of the handle to work with, I checked the exact length needed to match the other side of the bag and marked this with a pin. Once I'd done this, I carried on using the blanket stitch up to that pin point. Where the pins met, I was able to start sewing the tube back onto that main coil of the bag, forming the handle. I carried on with this for about an inch or two. Then I paused working on this part of the bag so that I could insert the reinforcement to the handle. So I've paused here for now, and I'm going to fill in this space here with another cord like this. I'm going to go all the way around in here, and then I'll do one last pass around the circle and over the handle, and it'll end right here. And then I'll be able to work on the middle bit that connects these two pieces together, because I want it to have quite a bit of depth. And then hopefully it'll be done. Yay! So adding that reinforcement piece is pretty simple. You just wrap the fabric tube in the same way as you did when you started the coil. Then once I had enough, about 6 inches, I started to sew it to the inner part of the handle. And same as before, I pull the thread through till it just disappears, then secure it in place with a stitch. And then I added a stitch to that inner tube piece just to secure it, to stop it from moving. And then I kept going around with a blanket stitch. It can get a little bit difficult around the corner. You might want to use a pin to push the tube into the corner to help keep it in place. Once I was close to the end, I checked the length and cut off the excess fabric and covered the end of it with a small piece of fabric. I didn't fold this over, so then when the two end pieces overlapped, it wasn't too bulky. So I blanket stitched until I got to my starting point, and then I put a stitch in to disguise where the sewing ended. Then we get to keep going and going and going and going until we get back to the handle. At this point, I change where the needle goes through the coil and position it so it's more on top, which will be the inside of the bag for me, so that the final reinforcement of the bag handle goes down the middle of the two handles that are already stitched together. This kind of braces them together. All you have to do is make sure you put the needle through both of those original two handle pieces to make sure that this third piece is completely secured to the handles. Once the handle's been completely reinforced with that third piece, then it's time to finish the half of the bag. I blanket stitched all the way up to the end, then I did a few regular back stitches into the end of the tube just to completely secure it in place. What I should have done was kept the end flat like I did with the reinforcement piece so that it wasn't too bulky. So if I make one of these again, I'll just change that. So for the side of the bag, I followed the same steps as before to make 6 long tubes to act as the side part of the bag, and fix them temporarily together with pins so that I could use them to cut out the lining of the bag. So I realised I haven't got a clip here at this point showing you how I decided what length to use for this side of the bag. Basically all I did was looked at one half of the bag, decided I'd quite like high-ish walls for it, and put pins approximately on either side where I thought the side should start and end. Then I folded it in half just to make sure that it was symmetrical. Obviously it's much easier to do when it's not stitched together. So I folded it in half, made sure that these two pins here were in the exact same place, and then when I was making the tubes, I just had the half of the bag that had the pins in it laid out on my table so that I could check the length against that piece. Then I drew around all the pieces on my lining fabric with some chalk and cut them out, and then I sewed them together ready to use later on. Next up, I need to sew these on one by one, so I'm going to be taking these apart. I'm going to sew them where I have my pin, and I'm going to use this outside piece of cord as the guide for where I need to attach these two. I'm going to start with the red and build it up, and finally I'll attach the other side to this purple piece. So attaching these side tubes to the side of the bag works in the same way as the rest of the bag. I do use a blanket stitch out of habit at this point, but a whipping stitch would probably work just fine. So I started off just by pinning the edges in place and then sewing them on. The only layer that was different was the purple one, because I chose to sew it to the layer below and then also sew it to the other side of the bag at the same time. So I pinned those 3 layers together just to stop things from moving around. I could have done this in 2 steps, but I thought that it would just end up looking too messy because then there'd be 2 sets of stitches. At this point I abandoned the blanket stitch and just whip stitched in place. Pieces, it's pretty simple. I placed that lining inside the bag, pinned that in place so I could see how the seams lined up with the seams of the bag, folded the edge over and then blanket stitched that in place as well. If you have a thimble, I would definitely recommend using it. I managed to stab myself in the finger with the blunt end of my sewing needle. And I know you've already seen it, but here's the finished bag. It just has that kind of rustic, loose thread charm to it. So things that I would change about it is I would make these handles longer. I've taken the bag out a few times now actually and used it, and it works practically. The handles do actually need a bit of fixing, so I might just extend them whilst I do that. I also wish I had chosen a different way to sew the lining in. I do like the fact that I've put a lining in it, just adds an extra bit of security to the bag. I still feel like it's going to fall apart, but I don't know if it's just by now I really don't like the blanket stitch, but maybe in the future if I find a way I like more, I'll take this lining out and redo it. And also perhaps I will redo the purple side layer just because it sticks up way too much on this side, even though it's almost perfect on this side. It's also it's a project that's going to take you some time, not just in the making of the bag, but in the gathering of the fabric. You don't want to just be going at your perfectly good fabric stash with a pair of scissors just to get the fabric in order to put the pieces together. It's more of an upcycling project, so if you're someone who is like me and you keep hold of things like fabric scraps in the hope that you find something useful to do with them, this is a nice ongoing project that you could do over time, a bit like those English paper piece quilts. Also, because of how long this bag takes to make, it's probably going to be kind of expensive. If you see anything a bit like this on for sale that is under like £100, you know that that person who's selling the bag is either not valuing their own labour correctly or is using someone else's labour and not compensating them fairly in order to turn a profit on the bag or the item, whatever they're making. You also don't need to follow the same colour scheme that I did, but when I have a new project that I want to do and I'm struggling to decide what colours to make, rainbow is my automatic go-to for many projects if I haven't already got a theme in mind. I love this bag, but I'm so glad I don't have to keep making it. So future me, hope you learned something. Everyone else, ditto, and thank you for watching as well. Bye!